This online lecture is one of 4 that I've put together to cover classical or ancient Greek art production. You can see from the chronology that I've set up on the screen that Greek art is divided into 5 periods. This lecture is going to cover 3 of these 5 periods: geometric, the Orientalizing, and the Archaic periods. Subsequent lectures will cover the classical transitional period. There will be a lecture set aside solely to cover the Athenian Acropolis, and then we have art that's produced under the Hellenistic period. You can see from the map that I have here on the screen that Greek art was produced in the same region that was once the Aegean region, which was art that we looked at in a previous lecture. Here we have Athens, which many scholars agree is the cultural center of ancient Greece, where some of the most fantastic examples of art and architecture were produced. Now we start with the geometric period, and the naming of this period as geometric is very convenient because it's descriptive. Basically, what we're seeing in the geometric period is art that has a very strong geometric emphasis, and where we can see that on this artwork is all of these geometric patterns, the rectangular patterns that we're seeing up here. We've got some triangular patterns that you can see here, here, and down here at the bottom. Now, the vessel that we see here is somewhat rare for the geometric period in that it contains figural representations, images of people and animals. Usually what we see in the geometric period are vessels that are covered entirely with geometric pattern. Let's talk about what we see here. We have 2 registers of representation that are placed at the crown of the vessel. The subject is funerary. Now, before we get into the subject matter, I'd like to first talk about common representations of form that we see in the geometric period. And there's really 2 that I'd like us to focus on. First of all, very common in the geometric period is the elongation of form, which you can see right in here. The other common feature, a geometric treatment of form seen primarily in a triangular torso, which you can see right here. Common representation of form. Now, let's talk about the subject matter. 2-part subject matter, both relating to funerary ritual. The prothesis, the laying out of the body, which is up here in this upper register, and then ekphora, the funeral procession, which is here at the lower register. Let's start with the lower register and work our way up, similar to the direction that we've read registered artwork when we were studying Mesopotamian art. So down here at the bottom we have our funerary procession, and you can see that this is a military procession. Here you have men that are carrying shields. The shield actually kind of erases their body. The shield takes the place of the body. And then we have horses and a chariot. And if you look at this image, you can see that really it's not very sophisticated. And this might be surprising because when we think about Greek art, we think about really incredibly and sophisticated examples of art that's very realistic. This is an appropriate thing to think about when you think about Greek art, but the point is it doesn't happen immediately, that it actually is a development that Greek artists are continually working towards to get artwork that's more realistic, that's more technically sophisticated. And I argue that goal isn't fully realized until the end, until the Hellenistic period. Although I will concede that we do see some really exciting and amazing things happening during the classical transitional period. I mean, even if you look at these horses, you have horses that are one next to each other. We're looking at them kind of like in profile, and yet it's kind of just like this blob sort of shape with heads coming out, with legs. And, you know, if you think back, you can think back to like the cave paintings of the horses in Chauvet during the Paleolithic period. Those were so realistic. That was so sophisticated. And this comes nowhere near as close. So with Greek art, there is room for improvement, and the Greek artists certainly take advantage of that as time passes. Now up here is our prothesis. Here is the laying out of the body, the deceased, and then you have on either side figures of people who are mourning. Now, this funerary subject matter is very important when you think about the function of this vessel. Now, let's talk about function, okay? Geometric crater. Crater is a functional vessel. It was something that the Greeks used. It had a few different possibilities in terms of function. Sometimes it was used for the storage or transportation of food. Sometimes it was used for the preparation of food or wine. Now, we've seen this, though, before, the idea of functional objects becoming art objects. We saw this back with the palette of Narmer from ancient Egypt, where you had this functional object that was used to, grind pigment for the eyes, but so much artistry was invested within the artwork that it sort of transcended that functionality and it becomes an artwork in and of itself. The same thing is happening in this case. There's so much artistic work that's been put into the adornment of this vessel, you wouldn't want to use it for everyday purposes because that might damage the vessel. What the function of this crater actually is it is a grave marker. It sits on top of grave. Now think about this. Considering the subject matter that you see here, who might be in that grave that this crater marks? If you're guessing that it perhaps is a soldier or high-ranking military man, you would be correct. And high ranking is an important thing to consider because not everyone's going to get a full-on military procession, all these people mourning. This is not an everyday person. Now, you also could suggest that this is a ruler who's buried underneath, because we know that in the past that kings, rulers, that they also oversaw the military as well. Okay, we move on to the Orientalizing period. This period's interesting because what I've seen throughout my years doing this is that this period tends to be glossed over or full-on skipped. And I think that's really a problem. This is an important period for us to look at because it's an important transitional period. What that means is that there's features in the art produced during this time that kind of link together or explain why we go from seeing what we saw in the geometric period to what we're going to see in the next slide when we get to the Archaic period. Transitional means that this style, we can see it in this figure here, has features that carry over from the preceding geometric period, but also incorporating new features that were not seen in that earlier period. So here's a little bit of a review for you. Looking at this sculpture, what do you see that is a carryover from the geometric period? If you said elongation of form, you would be correct. We see this primarily with the neck. If you said triangular torso or geometric treatment of form, you would also be correct. We have a very thin waist that is anatomically impossible. And what that creates is this triangle-like shape that you see here. So it carries both important stylistic features over from the geometric period. Now, what do we see that we wouldn't see? Well, one thing we do see very subtle hints of realism. I think they're beautiful, beautiful hints. This delicate dip of the shoulder as it connects to the torso. The slight suggestion of musculature. It foreshadows things to come, and I think that's exciting. Now I want to talk for a minute about the nudity. The nudity is extremely important. This is actually the most common way that men are represented in ancient Greek art as nude. And not just simply nude, but idealized or perfect. And that perfection comes from musculature as well as a careful consideration of proportions, which, by the way, is not happening yet in the Orientalizing period, obviously. Now, there's many different reasons why we see men depicted in the nude, and I address them at varying times over these 4 lectures. But I can speak to one reason right now, and that simply is just functionality. The point is to look at this image and to appreciate the beauty of the male form. You cannot appreciate this form if it is covered up by clothing. So the nudity is just a vehicle to appreciate perfect male form. Now let's talk about what we're looking at here. The sculpture is called Mantiklos Apollo, and I have read about it being interpreted in 2 different ways. Some scholars argue that this is a representation of the god Apollo. You can see that he was once holding something that is no longer there. These scholars say that if it was a bow and or an arrow, that this definitely would be a depiction of Apollo because he was commonly shown with those objects in art. Now another suggestion is that we're looking at an image of an everyday Athenian man named Antiklos. On the thighs you can see inscribed this text. Basically it's saying that Antiklos is making offerings to the god Apollo. So basically what he's doing is creating this image of himself and presenting it as an homage or an offering to a god. This sure does sound familiar to me. I feel like we've talked about this before. If you are also thinking about Mesopotamian votive figures, you would be correct. We saw this in Mesopotamia, where people would have images of themselves created, and they would be presented to gods as a form of worship. Now we move on to the Archaic period. We're looking at a Kouros figure. Kouros figures are generic representations of young men. Okay, generic, and what that means is that these are not intended to be portrait likeness of a specific man, just kind of a sculpture of a young guy. And I kind of say that with the Kouros figure, you've seen him once, you've seen him all. Despite a few different, very subtle variations, they pretty much look the same. It's very easy to spot a Kouros figure. Now I bring in some other images for us to compare to. Here we have our Orientalizing Period, Antiklos Apollo, and then we also have our Menkaure sculpture from Old Kingdom period Egypt. And I bring these in to show you that there is some influence that informed the archaic style, that it wasn't just a style that magically appeared out of nowhere, that there is some earlier influence that's operating here. Let's talk about this influence. We'll start with our Old Kingdom period example, and you can see how it translates over to the Archaic period in terms of this very stiff frontal figure. Stiffness, frontal positioning, which basically just means we look at the art object from the front. It's not like turned to the side in profile or from behind or any of those more complex positionings. It's very simple. We look at it from the front. Frontal and stiff. Like our Menkaure figure, we have the stiffness further emphasized by the clenching of the fists, the stepping forward of the leg with the knee locked. Now, let's look at this here, our Antiklos Apollo. What carries over? Well, we do have that slight suggestion of musculature, which I would actually argue is more realistic in our preceding Orientalizing period. But whatever. We have our slight suggestion of musculature, but what we have is we have a little bit of the geometric treatment of form. Not quite as extensive here, but it's here. We have the thinner waist, which does create a little bit of a triangular appearance, although again, not quite as dramatic as what we're seeing here. Now let's talk about specific features of the Archaic period. You can see that you have the braided hair that's right here. This is highly typical of the Archaic period. This is the only period of Greek art where we're seeing these braided hairstyles appear. They go away when we get to the classical transitional period. So this makes it very easy. If you're taking a midterm and you come across the braided hair, you can know immediately it's coming from Archaic period Greece. Now there is one other ancient culture that utilized the braid hair, the Etruscans, but we don't cover them till after the midterm, so this makes it easy for you when preparing to take your exam. So braided hair, typical of the archaic style. My own personal theory is that this is probably drawing from what we're seeing here, where you have tight braids that were preceded by these tight kind of like dreads that you see right here. Another feature of the Archaic period, which we're not seeing here but I'm going to mention so that you have all the information together in your notes, is an archaic smile. A slight smile. We don't see it here, as I said. We call it the archaic smile because, again, this is a feature that's specific to the Archaic period, and it's highly pervasive. We see it in many sculptures. Now, one other thing to talk about, and that is the function of the Kouros figure. The primary function was grave markers. The Kouros figure replaced the grave markers that we saw previously, the geometric period, the geometric crater. Now I have read alternative functions, which don't seem to be quite as frequent, that these were used in temples as offerings. Now, there is a female counterpart to the Kuros figure, which is the Kore figure. The sculpture that we see here is the peplos kore. It's called the peplos kore because the peplos is the garment that this woman's wearing. Let's talk about this. This is a major point of difference between the Kuros and the Kore figure. The Kuros figure, as we know, was nude. The Kore figure is clothed in her peplos. The reason for this is that at this point in time, the Archaic period, it was not yet considered appropriate to depict females in the nude. This does not happen until the classical transitional period. With the peplos, it does create a further sense of stiffness, which we know is typical for the Archaic period. She's frontal, also typical, and the peplos just hangs like a solid mass. We don't see anything underneath that suggests relaxed form. She appears to be standing very stiff with knees locked. Also typical of the Archaic period, we have our braids in the hair, and we have the smile. Now the function of the kore is different from the Kuros figure. The kore was not used as a burial marker. The kore figure instead was used primarily as offerings in temples. I include this reconstruction here. You can see the arm extended with the offering gift. I also include this reconstruction because you can see that this sculpture was originally painted. In fact, most of what the Greeks produced was originally painted in these very bright and what I personally think to be garish colors. In fact, most ancient work was painted. And I always tell students that you can make that assumption. You can assume that it was originally painted, and 9 out of 10 times you will be correct. Now here we have the calf bearer. I include the calf bearer for a couple of reasons. One, I do see a common mistake, which is perfectly understandable, of people assuming that all male figures produced during the Archaic period are Kuros figures, and that is not correct. It's tempting to make this assumption because the style is so similar. This looks like a Kuros figure. He has the braided hair. This guy has the archaic smile, which our Kuros figure didn't have. He's stiff. He's frontal. He has one leg stepping forward. So then what is it that indicates that this figure is not a Kuros figure? Now some people say it's the calf that sits on his shoulders. That's actually not it. Some people say that it's the garment, that he's clothed. You can see a thin garment. And that's actually not it either. What indicates that this is not a Kuros figure is the presence of the beard. Remember that beards indicate age. Kuros figures are representations of young men. Because we see a beard, we know that we're not looking at a representation of a young man. We're looking at an older man, who in this case is believed to be bringing an offering to Athena. Scholars think that it's an offering to Athena because this was found outside of the Parthenon, which is the temple dedicated to Athena, and this temple is located on the Acropolis. Now there's one other reason why I wanted to show you this image, and it's kind of to sort of set things up for when we begin later on in the semester our study of early Christian art. In early Christian art, we see a common representation of Jesus as the Good Shepherd, where Jesus is shown with a sheep over his shoulders. I want to make clear that this is not a unique motif, that the Christians did not invent this idea of a man carrying an animal on his shoulders. As you can see from this image, the Christians have actually appropriated something that dates back to the Archaic period. And if we're going to be really technical about this, technically this image of the man carrying an animal on his shoulder is even earlier. We can see examples of this in tomb painting as early as ancient Egypt. All right, we finished up with a few architectural terms. We are looking at the Temple of Athena Nike, which is located on the Acropolis in Athens. Now, the temple that we see here is a great example of the Greek post and lintel system. We studied the post and lintel system when we were looking at Neolithic architecture, more specifically Stonehenge. With the post and lintel system, as you may recall, the posts are a series of vertical objects, which here the posts are replaced, the posts are replaced by columns. We know that the posts hold up a horizontal element, the lintel, but when we describe Greek art, we become a little bit more different or specific in our terminology, and we say entablature. So the columns are the posts, they hold up the lintel or the entablature. Now let's talk about the columns. We have stone columns. We know that this is not the first instance in architectural history that we see a stone column. We know that the Egyptians were the first to create the stone column. The columns that we see here are fluted. They have these linear grooves that have been carved in. We know that that also is not unique or original, that too was first seen in ancient Egypt. Now up here, the entablature. Now I want to be very clear, the entablature is this entire rectangular space that I'm outlining with this arrow. This whole thing is the entablature. I often encourage students to sketch this out because this is very commonly confused. So the whole entire rectangular area is the entablature. Now the entablature is divided into two parts. You only have to know one part, and that is the frieze. Now what indicates you're looking at the frieze is stuff. The reason why I say stuff is because it's not going to be one set thing all the time. Now in this case, we are seeing the frieze, and it has in here relief sculpture. Sometimes you'll see these like linear designs called triglyphs. They can be the frieze, or you could even see text, and that's the frieze. This part under here, don't need to know. Here's some other terminology that we've already covered, just putting it in for review. We have the shaft, the body of the column, the base, the bottom of the column. Now, a couple more things. We have our Greek architectural orders, which are kind of like styles of architecture. And the easiest way to determine a Greek architectural order is to look at the column. And what's even easier about determining the architectural order based on the column is to look at the capital, which is the top of the column. Capital here, capital here, capital here. You can see that these are the most distinctive components of the column. Makes it easiest to identify if one was taking a midterm, which by the way you're for sure going to have to do on your own midterm. Now there's 3 Greek architectural orders, and they did develop one after the other, becoming increasingly complex, as you can see as time passes. The earliest Greek architectural order is the Doric order, characterized by this very plain capital. The other thing that characterizes the Doric order is the fact that it's very wide. It's the widest of the 3. Now this actually does kind of matter. It has to do with the fluting. Down here you can see a fragment of a Doric column that has come from the Parthenon. You can see that the fluting is spread out so far that it's as wide as I can spread my hand out. This affects the visual appeal of the column. These are more simple because there's less lines. As the columns become thinner, the fluting becomes denser, it creates more linear patterns. We have the Ionic order next, which is characterized by a capital that has swirls on it. Now you know that swirls is not an art historical term. We say volute. So the volute is the swirls that you see here. And then finally, the Corinthian order, which this is a little pixelated, but this is foliate pattern, leaves. Now, just a little point of warning. Right in here, what you see here, these are baby volutes. Sometimes people see the baby volutes and they'll think, oh, volute, Ionic. That's incorrect. You'll see that with the Ionic order, the volutes take up the majority of the capital. If there's any kind of leaves or flowers or whatever, can't be Ionic. So here's a little test for you. Going back, what order do you see here? If you answered Ionic, you are correct.